And so we settle in. You can feel your body beginning to grow heavy in the most pleasant way. In our time together tonight, there is nothing to examine, nothing to understand, only the gentle rhythm of a story. A story about a family whose ambition was so great, it was written not in ink, but in blood. The story of the Habsburgs. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet, like, or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. And as you do that, or perhaps choose not to, which is perfectly fine, you might let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a quiet comfort to know where these stories are landing. All right, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing, and together, let's allow the story to begin. You find yourself standing in the chilly stone corridor of a European castle. It's the late 15th century. Don't worry about the details, the exact year, the specific castle. They are soft and blurry, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. What matters is the feeling. What matters is the feeling. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp stone. Torchlight flickers, casting lull, dancing shadows that seem to have a life of their own. Muffled sounds of a distant banquet go down the hall, but here, in this quiet corner, you can hear the whispers. The whispers are about a family. They're not a particularly ancient family, not compared to the great dynasties of France or England. They started as minor counts from a castle in what is now Switzerland, a place called Habsburg or Hawk's Castle. A decent enough name, but hardly one that screams future rulers of the known world. Yet, something is happening. This family, the Habsburgs, is expanding. They are acquiring lands, titles, and power at its nervous, and they're not doing it with grand armies or bloody conquests. Their method is quieter, more strategic, and some might say, far more effective. You lean closer to a heavy tapestry, pretending to admire the stitching. But are you really listening to two old courtiers muttering to each other? One of them sighs and shakes his head, stroking his beard. Balaji Irant Ali, he murmurs, to Felix Austrian Noobs. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. But it's the key to everything. The phrase that will define this family for centuries. It means let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Think about that for a moment. While other kingdoms are spending fortunes on soldiers, sharpening swords, and bleeding out on muddy battlefields, the Habsburgs are focused on something else entirely. They're looking at guest lists. They're arranging flowers and sending out wedding invitations. Their primary weapon isn't the cannon, it's the marriage contract. Every royal wedding is a corporate merger. Every newborn prince or princess isn't just a child, it's a future asset. A chess piece to be played in the grand game of continental domination. And the grand master of this game, the man who really perfected this strategy, was an emperor named Maximilian I. You can almost picture him, a man with a famously long nose and an even longer list of ambitions. He was the ultimate royal networker. He saw Europe not as a map of kingdoms, but as a web of family connections, and he was determined to place a Habsburg at the center of it all. He married his son, Philip, to the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. He married his daughter, Margaret, to their son. He even tried to betroth his infant granddaughter to the future King of England. It was a dizzying flurry of alliances, all sealed with a vow and a ring. Now for a little bit of trivia, Maximilian was so obsessed with his legacy that he spent decades and a ridiculous amount of money commissioning a massive elaborate tomb for himself, featuring over 40 life-sized bronze statues of his ancestors and heroes, including King Arthur, just for good measure. The funny part, the tomb was so huge and expensive that it was never finished, and he wasn't even buried in it. A perfect monument to an ambition that sometimes outstripped reality. But was this marriage policy a carefully planned, multi-minus generational master plan? Historians still debate this. Was Maximilian a political genius, playing a game of 4D chess while everyone else was playing checkers? Or was he simply a very shrewd, very lucky, and very persistent opportunist? Perhaps he was just exceptionally good at spotting an opportunity, a single and ready to mingle royal heir with a lot of land to their name. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in the murky middle. But whether by grand design or a series of fortunate events, the strategy was working. The whispers in the hallway are getting more excited now. They speak of the biggest prize of all, a kingdom newly unified, flush with wealth from a world just discovered across the ocean. A kingdom called Spain. The board is set, the pieces are in place, and an invitation is being drawn up for the wedding that will change the world, the one that will officially unite the Habsburgs with the Spanish crown. And you have a front minus Rosie. The whispers in the corridor fade, replaced by a new sound. It's the deep, resonant drone of a cathedral organ, a sound so low and powerful you feel it in your bones before you can even place it. The torchlight gives way to the jeweled glow of sunlight filtering through immense stained minus glass windows. You've moved from the shadows into the heart of the ceremony. You are now a guest at the wedding. Find a place for yourself, somewhere behind a thick marble pillar. From here, you can see everything without being seen. The air is heavy with the sweet, spicy scent of incense and the slightly less sweet scent of hundreds of nobles packed a little too closely together. Look at the fabrics. Deep velvets, shimmering silks, cloth minus gold that seems to drink the light. Jewels glitter on every neck and finger. This isn't just a wedding. It's a display of power, a silent declaration of wealth and influence. At the altar you see him, Philip, the son of the emperor. He is everything a Renaissance prince is supposed to be, tall, athletic, with the fair hair of his German ancestors. And for once, the nickname isn't just raw propaganda. He carries himself with an easy confidence, an almost casual air, as if marrying the heiress to the most powerful kingdom in Europe is all in a day's work. His entourage from Burgundy is just like him, flamboyant to nothing, dressed in the latest, most extravagant fashions. And then you see her, Juana of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the legendary monarchs who forged the nation of Spain. She is the opposite of Philip. Where he is fair, she is dark. Where he is fair, she is wound-tight with an intensity that is almost unnerving. You can see it in her eyes, a deep, burning focus fixed entirely on her future husband. For her, this is not a political transaction. You can tell, even from this distance, that she has fallen desperately, obsessively in love. The ceremony itself is long and formal, spoken in a language, Latin, that most of the attendees don't fully understand. But they don't need to. They understand the exchange of rings. They understand the exchange of rings. They understand the moment the bishop joins their hands. In that single, quiet moment, a fusion reaction takes place. The sprawling, ambitious Habsburg domains are fused with the immense wealth and power of Spain, its Italian possessions, and its brand minus new, treasure minus filled empire across the Atlantic. The motto has been fulfilled. An empire has just been won, not with a single drop of blood, but with a simple I do. Here's a curious little detail you might notice if you watch them closely. The two courts, his and hers, are like oil and water. Philip's Burgundian court is a place of lavish parties, tournaments, and courtly love poetry, while a Spanish court is austere, deeply religious and formal. It's a culture clash happening in real time right there at the altar. You can see the Spanish nobles looking with disapproval at the flashy clothes of the Burgundians, who in turn are stifling yawns at the solemnity of the Spanish ceremony. It's a small crack, a hint that this perfect union might not be so perfect behind closed doors. And this brings us to the whispers that surround the bride. Juana? History will give her a terrible name, Juana la Loca. Joanna the Mad. But was she? This is one of those questions where historians draw lines in the sand. Some argue that she was genetically predisposed to mental illness, that the pressures of her position and her obsessive love for a frequently unfaithful husband simply shuttered her mind. They point to her erratic behavior, her jealous rages, and her later, infamous refusal to be separated from her husband's body after his death. But other historians will tell you a different, more tragic story. They suggest that Juana was not mad, but merely a woman of intense passion and intelligence in a world that had no place for it. They argue that her powerful male relatives, her father, her husband, and later her own son, had every reason to want her declared incompetent. If she was mad, she couldn't rule. They could rule in her name, seizing control of the vast Spanish Empire. Was her madness a genuine affliction, or was it a convenient political label, a prison made of words, to neutralize a woman who had more legitimate right to the throne than any of them? The debate is still very much alive. For now, though, all of that is in the future. For now, you simply watch as the newlyweds walk back down the aisle, past you, past the rows of calculating nobles. Philip is smiling, acknowledging the cheers. Juana has eyes only for him. The first critical link in the chain of the Spanish Habsburgs has been forged. The bloodlines have been mixed, and the genetic clock has just started ticking. The sounds of the cathedral organ fade, replaced by the quiet, shuffling atmosphere of a royal court. The grand ceremony is over, and now begins the daily, intricate dance of politics and personal life. You're no longer in the cavernous church, but in a more intimate setting, a private gallery, hung with heavy tapestries and portraits of stern miners-looking ancestors. Sunlight thick with dust motes streams in from a high window. It's here in the relative quiet that you can begin to really observe the family up close. Your attention is drawn to the couple at the center of it all, Philip and Juana. But as you watch them interact with the courtiers, and with each other, your gaze keeps settling on one particular feature. A feature that Philip the Handsome, for all his good looks, possesses. It's his chin, his jaw. It's not overtly strange at this point. Not yet. You might not even notice it at first glance. But, if you look carefully, you'll see it. His lower jaw is slightly more pronounced than it should be. It juts forward, just a little, giving him a perpetually stubborn, almost pouty expression. His lower lip is full, heavier than the upper one. In the official court portraits, the artists have done their best to minimize it, to paint him from a flattering angle, to soften the lines. But in person, in the unforgiving light of the gallery, you can see it. It's the beginning of a legacy, a physical trait so distinctive that it will be passed down through the family like a cursed crown. It will become known to history as the Habsburg jaw. You start to look around the gallery at the other relatives present. You see it in his father, Maximilian, though less pronounced. You see hints of it in his sister. It's a family signature. In an age before photography, when royal portraits were the only way to know what a distant monarch looked like, this jaw became an instantly recognizable brand. To see that child legitimacy, and a bloodline that was, quite literally, reshaping the continent. But what exactly was it? Medically, the condition is known as mandibular prognathism. It's a skeletal abnormality where the lower jaw outgrows the upper jaw. It's often accompanied by a thick lower lip and a prominent nose. It's a highly heritable trait, meaning it passes through families with remarkable consistency. And while it could be a mere cosmetic quirk in its milder forms, in more severe cases, it could make life difficult. Chewing properly becomes a challenge. Even simply closing one's mouth could be an awkward, uncomfortable affair. For a monarch whose life is one of constant public performance of giving speeches, eating at state banquets, and whispering sweet nothings to a potential spouse, it was a deeply unfortunate inheritance. And here's a strange little tidbit about royal appearances. In this era, the Spanish court had a very specific, and rather odd, obsession with the mouth. Etiquette dictated that queens, in particular, should barely open their mouths when they spoke, and they were certainly not supposed to laugh out loud. It was considered undignified. One Spanish queen, the French born wife of a later Habsburg king, was famously chastised for laughing, with a stern lady in waiting telling her, "A queen of Spain does not laugh." So, in a weird twist of fate, a family with a genetic trait that made it hard to close their mouths properly had married into a culture that demanded they keep them shut. Now, it's crucial to understand that at this point, no one is thinking about genetics. The science simply doesn't exist. They don't know about dominant and recessive genes. They understand that children tend to look like their parents, of course, but their understanding is based on vague notions of blood and lineage. They see the jaw not as a genetic marker, but as a sign of strong Habsburg blood. a physical manifestation of their identity. They are, in a way, proud of it. It's a stamp of authenticity. Was the jaw already a serious problem for Philip the Handsome? Not really. Historians who have examined his remains suggest his condition was relatively mild. It was a quirk, a conversation piece, perhaps. But it was also a warning. It was a single, discordant note in the grand symphony of their success. It was a physical trait that, when passed down undamplified through generations of intermarriage, would transform from a symbol of identity into a symbol of decay. You watch as Philip turns to speak to an ambassador. He inclines his head, and for a moment, the light catches his profile. You see the unmistakable line of his jaw, the slight but definite protrusion. It's just a chin. But in the long, slow, and tragic story of the Spanish Habsburgs, it is chapter 1. And it's a chapter written on the very bones of their faces. The intimate gallery with its dusty sunbeams dissolves, and you find yourself standing on a different kind of balcony. This one is high up, overlooking a vast city square, somewhere in the heart of Europe. It could be Brussels, or Augsburg, or Valladolid. The exact location is less important than the sheer scale of the scene. The square below is a sea of people, a roaring, cheering mass of humanity. Banners snap in the wind, emblazoned with a bewildering array of crests and symbols. You are witnessing the zenith, the absolute peak of the Habsburg project. The little boy born to Philip the Handsome and one of the mad has grown up. His name is Charles, and he is now, through an absolutely staggering series of fortunate deaths and inheritances, the most powerful man in the world. Let's just quickly run through his inheritance list, because it sounds like something from a fantasy novel. From his mother, Juana, he inherited all of Spain, with its Italian territories of Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, and of course, the entirety of the still mindless and folding Spanish Empire in the Americas. We're talking about the land of the Aztecs and the Incas, with mountains of gold and silver. From his father, Philip, he inherited the Netherlands, Burgundy, and Franche Minus, and from his grandfather, Maximilian, he inherited the Habsburg heartlands in Austria and, most importantly, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. It's an empire that defies geography. It's a patchwork quilt of kingdoms, duchies, and territories scattered all across the map. A famous phrase is coined to describe its sheer, unbelievable scale, the empire on which the sun never sets. And it's not just poetry. It is literally true. When the sun was setting over his lands in Germany, it was high noon over his colonies in Peru. Somewhere at every single moment of every single day, the sun was shining on a piece of land ruled by this one man, Charles V. You look at him now, standing at the edge of the balcony, acknowledging the crowd. He is not a handsome man like his father. He is pale, often sickly, and he has inherited the family jaw in a much more pronounced form. For Charles, it is not a minor quirk, it's a genuine impediment. His teeth did not meet correctly, making it a lifelong struggle for him to chew his food. He often ate alone, hidden from the prying eyes of the court, to avoid the embarrassment of the difficult, messy process. Yet, despite this, there is an undeniable aura of power about him. He is burdened, serious, and deeply, profoundly aware of the weight of the world that rests on his shoulders. Now, a little known fact about running such a massive, disconnected empire in the 16th century is the sheer amount of time you have to spend on the road. Charles was perpetually in motion. He had no single capital city. The court was wherever he was. He was constantly traveling between Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, trying to hold his sprawling inheritance together through sheer personal presence. Historians have calculated that he spent nearly a quarter of his entire reign just traveling from one part of his empire to another. Imagine running a global corporation, but the only way to talk to your regional managers is to spend 6 months on a horse to go see them. It was a logistical nightmare. The cheering of the crowd below is deafening. They see a symbol of unity, of power, of divine favor. But you, with the benefit of hindsight, can see something else. You can see the impossibility of it all. This empire is too big, too diverse, too complicated for any one person to rule. The very success of the Habsburg marriage strategy has created a political entity that is fundamentally unsustainable. And Charles knows it. He is fighting wars on every front. HES fighting France, his great rival. HES fighting the Ottoman Empire, which is pushing into the Mediterranean and Central Europe. And HES fighting a fire within his own house, the Protestant Reformation, which is tearing his German lands apart. He is one man trying to hold back for different tides at once. Historians still marvel at his reign. Some see him as the last great medieval emperor, a man trying to hold on to the dream of a unified Christian Europe. Others see him as the first truly modern ruler, grappling with the complexities of global politics and finance. Was he a visionary or a man trapped by a legacy to vast control? The consensus is that he was a bit of both, a man of immense talent and dedication who was simply handed an impossible job. As you stand on that balcony watching the banners fly, you feel a sense of awe but also a sense of foreboding. This moment, this peak of power feels fragile. It's too much. The sheer weight of all these crowns on one man's head is crushing. And as Charles turns to go back inside, away from the adoring crowds, you see the exhaustion on his face. He has reached the summit. But he knows, better than anyone, that from the summit, the only way to go is down, and he is already thinking about how to manage the descent. The roar of the crowd fades, and the grand public balcony gives way to a small private chamber. The air here is still and heavy, thick with the smell of old wood, beeswax, and tired ink. A large, detailed map of Europe is spread across a heavy oak table. It's a mess of overlapping colors and disputed borders. Standing over the map is the Emperor Charles V, but he looks older now where I are. The youthful ambition has been worn away by decades of constant warfare and travel. He is not alone. With him is his younger brother, Ferdinand. The two men are a study in contrasts. Charles, the world-minded weary traveler, the global emperor. Ferdinand, who has spent most of his life in the German-minded speaking lands, is more practical, more focused on the immediate problems of Central Europe. There is affection between them, but also the undeniable tension that comes from sharing such an immense inheritance. You are witnessing a pivotal, and perhaps inevitable, moment of decision. Charles has come to a profound realization. The empire is too big, the job is impossible. The sheer weight of it all, of governing Spain and its colonies, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire simultaneously, is crushing him. He is tired. His health is failing, and he needs a plan. And he needs a plan. Not a plan for retreat. A plan for how to make the unmanageable manageable. He places a hand on the map, his fingers tracing a line across the Alps. On one side, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, the Americas. On the other, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He has decided to do something unprecedented. He is going to retire, and he is going to split the family fortune into. To his son, Philip II, he will give the rich, powerful Spanish inheritance. Philip will become the king of Spain, and with it, the ruler of a vast global empire. To his brother, Ferdinand, he will cede the ancestral Habsburg lands in Austria and ensure his succession to the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The family will no longer be a single entity. From now on, there will be two major branches, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. It's a remarkably pragmatic solution to an impossible problem. The two branches will be allies, of course. They will support each other, coordinate their foreign policy, and present a united front against their enemies, like France and the Ottoman Empire. They will be two pillars holding up the same great house. But this division creates a new and ultimately fatal problem. How do you ensure this alliance remains unbreakable for all time? How do you make sure that these two family branches never drift apart, never become rivals? The answer is already in the Habsburg playbook. The same tool they used to build the empire, they will now use to maintain it, marriage, but with a crucial, dangerous difference. Before they had married outwards, absorbing other dynasties into their own. Now they will begin to marry inwards. The Spanish Habsburgs will marry the Austrian Habsburgs. The Austrian Habsburgs, Uncles will marry the Spanish Habsburgs. Uncles will marry nieces. First cousins will marry first cousins. The goal is to keep the bloodline pure, to keep the two halves of the dynasty so tightly interwoven that they can never be pulled apart. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, takes on a new, more insular meaning. Now, it's not about marrying for new lands, but about marrying to keep the lands they already have. Here's a curious little detail that shows the mindset of the time. While marriage between such close relatives was forbidden by the church, the Habsburgs were so powerful that they could almost always get a special permission, a papal dispensation, to allow it. It became a routine part of their family planning. Getting a blessing from the Pope to marry your niece was just another piece of royal paperwork, like signing a treaty or raising taxes. The survival of the dynasty was a matter of state security, so important that it trumped even the sacred rules of kinship. Historians are still divided on the long-term thinking here. Did they understand the potential risks? It's highly unlikely they understood it in a genetic sense. But did they notice on some level that these unions produced a higher number of frail infants and sickly children? Perhaps. But they would have seen it as a matter of bad luck or divine disfavor, not as a predictable biological outcome of their own actions. In their worldview, the purity of the bloodline was a source of strength, not weakness. They believed they were concentrating their royal blood, making it more potent, more powerful. In reality, they were creating a closed system, a genetic echo chamber where any harmful trait, once introduced, could never escape. You watch as Charles V explains his decision to his brother. It is a moment of immense historical importance, a quiet, rational decision made in a candlelit room that will have catastrophic consequences down the line. They are not villains cackling over a map. They are weary politicians trying to find the best solution to a problem of their own making. They believe they are saving their dynasty. They have no way of knowing they are signing its death warrant. The two branches are formally created. The two bloodlines begin to flow, separate but destined to endlessly fold back into one another, turning from a mighty river into a stagnant, poison pool. The map on the table seems to dissolve, the lines of countries and rivers fading into the polished wood grain. In its place, another kind of chart is being drawn, this time on a long, scrolling piece of parchment. You are in a scriptorium now, a quiet room dedicated to records and histories. The only sound is the gentle scratching of a quill pen, wielded by a meticulous court genealogist. He is updating the family's official lineage. He works with intense concentration, dipping his pen in a pot of dark ink, drawing fine, elegant lines that connect names and titles. He draws a line down from Charles V to his son, Philip I of Spain. Then he draws another line down from Charles's brother, Ferdinand I of Austria, to his children. This is where a normal family tree would begin to branch out, to spread its limbs wide, seeking new life and new connections. But you watch, with a growing sense of unease, as the genealogist's hand does something strange. The lines don't branch out. They curve, they bend. They turn back inwards. He draws a line from one side of the parchment, representing the Austrian court, and gracefully loops it right back across to the Spanish side. He is connecting the son of one emperor to the daughter of the other, the great minus niece to the great minus uncle, the cousin to the cousin. The family tree is no longer a tree. It is becoming a wreath, a closed circle, a loop that feeds back into itself, over and over again. You are witnessing the first generation of this new strategy in action. The ink is still wet on the marriage contract between Philip I of Spain, the most powerful man in the new generation, and his bride, Anna of Austria. She is not some stranger from a rival court. She is his niece. Her father was the Austrian emperor, and her mother was Philip's own sister. It's a tight, perfect, dizzying little knot. For the Habsburgs, this marriage is a triumph of policy. It reinforces the alliance between the two branches. It ensures that their children will have an unshakable claim to both inheritances. It keeps the Habsburg blood pure and undiluted by foreign influences. They are building a fortress of blood to protect their vast fortune. But what was it like to be the currency in this transaction? Imagine for a moment you are a young Arctiscus, born in the Austrian palace in Vienna. From the moment you can understand language, you know your destiny. You are not taught how to rule a kingdom, You are taught how to be the perfect consort for a king. Specifically, for your cousin or your uncle in Spain. Your playmates are your future in minus laws. The letters you exchange are not with friends, but with your future spouse, a man you may not meet until your wedding day. Your world is incredibly small and suffocatingly luxurious. It's a gilded cage where the only window looks out onto the other branch of your own family. This was the fate of Anna, and countless other Habsburg women after her. They were the living threads, used to stitch the two halves of the dynasty together. This brings us to a fascinating debate among historians. Was this policy of intermarriage purely a cold, cynical political calculation? Or was there something else at play? On one hand, of course it was political. These marriages were the bedrock of their international security. But some historians argue that after a generation, it simply became normal. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria created their own tiny, unique international culture. They shared the same worldview, the same deep Catholic faith, the same political goals, and the same peculiar sense of family duty. From this perspective, marrying a French or English princess would have been a far greater risk. That would mean bringing a true outsider into the heart of the family, someone who might have different loyalties, a different language, a different way of doing things. Marrying your Austrian cousin, on the other hand, was safe. It was comfortable. It was predictable. It was predictable. You knew what you were getting. So was it a calculated risk to preserve power, or was it the ultimate form of dynastic echo chamber, where marrying anyone but a close relative seemed like the truly strange and dangerous option? The answer is likely a complex and uncomfortable mix of both. You look back at the genealogist. He has finished his work for the day. He holds the parchment up to the light, admiring the elegant looping lines. He sees a masterpiece of dynastic stability, a perfect closed loop. He has no way of knowing that a closed loop is also the perfect design for a trap. The ink dries on the parchment, sealing the fates of generations to come. The first threads of the wreath have been tied, and with each new knot, the circle will grow tighter. The quiet scriptorium dissolves and you find yourself in the sprawling, shadowy halls of a Spanish palace. The El Escorial perhaps, or the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. The grandeur is immense, but it feels cold, austere. The portraits on the walls are stern-faced kings and pious-looking queens, all of them bearing that familiar, elongated Habsburg face. There is a hush in these halls, a pervasive quiet that feels less like peace and more like suppressed anxiety. The whispers you hear now are not about weddings and alliances, but about something far more troubling. They are about the heir to the throne. They are about Don Carlos, the eldest son of Philip II. From the very beginning, something was wrong with Carlos. His birth in 1545 was incredibly difficult, and he grew into a child who was physically frail and misshapen. He had a slight hunchback and one leg was shorter than the other, giving him a pronounced limp. But it was his mind, his temperament, that caused the real alarm. As he grew, he displayed signs of severe mental and emotional instability. He was prone to fits of uncontrollable rage, followed by periods of deep, melancholic silence. He was cruel, known for roasting animals alive for his own amusement. He was erratic and unpredictable, a constant source of fear and embarrassment to the obsessively formal and controlled Spanish court. You catch a glimpse of him now, a young man stalking down a corridor. His movements are jerky, his face contorted in a permanent cowl. Courtiers flatten themselves against the walls as he passes, avoiding eye contact. They know that the slightest perceived insult could provoke a violent outburst. There are stories whispered in the darkest corners of the palace, of him trying to push a servant out of a window, of him biting his attendants, of him publicly humiliating nobles for no reason at all. This was a terrifying problem for Philip II. A king's first duty was to produce a viable heir to carry on the dynasty. And this was his heir. This volatile, unpredictable boy was supposed to one day rule the most powerful empire on earth. Philip tried everything. He moved his son to a different city, hoping a change of scenery would help. He assigned him tutors and handlers, who all eventually quit in despair. He even tried to involve him in matters of state, a disastrous experiment that only exposed Carlos's complete incapacity for rational thought. Now, a particularly strange and tragic episode in Don Carlos' life centered on a fall. When he was a teenager, he tumbled down a flight of stairs and sustained a severe head injury. To save his life, the royal surgeons performed a trepanation, the ancient practice of drilling a hole into the skull. But medicine wasn't the only tool they used. In a move that feels utterly bizarre to us, the preserved body of a local saint, Diego of Alcala, was brought into his bedchamber and laid beside him, in the desperate hope that a miracle would cure him. Incredibly, Carlos did recover, but his behavior only grew more erratic. Whether this was due to the original injury, the surgery, or his underlying condition is impossible to know. So what was wrong with Don Carlos? Was this the first terrible fruit of the dynasty's inward, standing family tree? The answer is complex, and historians and scientists continue to debate it. Don Carlos was the product of 4 generations of Habsburg intermarriage. His parents, Philippi and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, were double first cousins. The genetic loop was already tightening. It is highly probable that his physical and mental disabilities were a direct result of this accumulated inbreeding. He was the first clear warning sign, a flashing red light on the dynasty's dashboard. However, it's also true that his father, Philippi, was a cold, distant, and incredibly demanding parent. Some historians argue that Carlos' problems were as much psychological as they were genetic. They suggest he was a troubled young man rebelling against a father he could never please, trapped in a court that had no tolerance for any deviation from the norm. His madness, in this view, was amplified by his environment. The story ends in tragedy. As a young man, Carlos began to plot against his own father, even making contact with rebels in the Netherlands who were Philip's sworn enemies. It was an act of treason. With a heavy heart, Philip Carlos's health rapidly declined. He engaged in bizarre behaviors, alternating between starving himself and then binge-eating, drinking vast quantities of ice water. Within 6 months, he was dead. The whispers in the palace fall silent. A deep, sorrowful quiet descends. The official cause of death was his own fragile health, but the courts of Europe buzzed with darker rumors that the cold king of Spain had ordered his own son's murder. Whatever the truth, the problem of Don Carlos was solved. But the underlying issue, the poison in the family's blood, remained. The first warning had been silenced, but it would not be the last. The cold, stone corridors of the Spanish palace seemed to fade away, and for a moment, you are in a different kind of space. It's not a physical place, but a conceptual one. Imagine a vast, quiet library. Instead of books, the shelves are filled with countless spools of thread, each one representing a person's genetic code. Most of the spools are unique, woven from threads of every color, gathered from countless different sources. But here in the section marked Habsburg, something is different. The spools are all woven from the same few colors over and over. The threads are not new, they are simply recycled from the spools on the shelf above. Let's take a moment to step away from the story and understand, in a very simple, gentle way, what was happening inside that fortress of blood. You don't need to be a scientist. Think of it like this. Every person carries 2 copies of almost every gene in their body, one from their mother, one from their father. Some genes are dominant gene for, say, brown eyes from just one parent. Easy enough. But some genes are recessive. These are the shy ones. You need to inherit the same recessive gene from both parents for it to show itself. Most of the time, these recessive genes are harmless, but sometimes they can carry instructions for problems. A weaker immune system, a physical abnormality, a predisposition to a certain illness. In the general population, this isn't usually a big problem. The gene pool is vast and diverse. The chances of you and a completely unrelated partner both happening to carry the same rare, harmful recessive gene are incredibly small. Your partner's healthy, dominant gene will usually override your shy, problematic one, and the potential issue remains hidden, silent, and harmless. But what happens when you don't marry an unrelated partner? What happens when you marry your cousin? Your family shares a recent common ancestor, your grandparents. This means you and your cousin have a much higher chance of having inherited the exact same set of genes from them, including the same rare, recessive ones. if you both inherited the same problematic gene from your shared grandmother, and you have a child, there is now a 1 minus in minus for chance that this child will get a copy of that problematic gene from both of you. Suddenly, the shy gene isn't shy anymore. It has no healthy dominant gene to hide behind. It can now express itself, and the hidden problem becomes a reality. Now imagine doing this not just once, but for generation after generation. An uncle marries his niece. Their children, who are now more genetically similar than regular siblings, marry their cousins. The Habsburgs weren't just dipping their toes into a shallow gene pool. They were sealing themselves inside a tiny, echoing chamber. Any recessive trait that existed in their founding ancestors, like, for instance, the gene for that prominent jaw, or perhaps a gene for a weaker constitution, was trapped. With every inbound marriage, they were essentially playing a game of genetic roulette, but they kept adding more and more bullets to the chamber. They were systematically increasing the odds, generation by generation, that these hidden genetic dangers would emerge from the shadows. Here's a fascinating, if slightly grim, bit of math that scientists have done. They developed a measurement called the inbreeding coefficient. A score of 0 means you are the child of two completely unrelated people. The child of first cousins has a coefficient of 0.06 to fifth. Now, let's look at the Spanish Habsburgs. Philip I, the father of the tragic Don Carlos, had a coefficient of about 0.1. That's already quite high. But the last king of their line, the culmination of all this intermarriage, would have a coefficient of over 0.25. To put that in perspective, that is the same level of genetic similarity you would get from the child of a brother and a sister. They had, through generations of acceptable uncle minus niece and cousin minus cousin pairings, achieved a level of inbreeding that was biologically catastrophic. Of course, the people in our story have no concept of this. When they talk of blood, they mean it in a mystical way. They speak of good blood, strong blood, royal blood. They believe they are purifying and strengthening it, like a blacksmith tempering steel. This is the central, tragic irony of their story. The very thing they believed was their greatest source of strength, the purity of their blood, was, in scientific reality, their most profound and inescapable weakness. Historians still debate how much the Habsburgs themselves noticed. Did the courtiers whisper about the Habsburg look becoming more extreme? Did the royal physicians note a pattern of infant mortality and ill health? Yes, almost certainly, but they would have had no framework to understand the true cause. They would have blamed it on a curse, on God's will, on a miasma in the air, on the individual weakness of the mother. They would have looked everywhere for an explanation, except for the one place it truly resided, in the very marriage contracts they so proudly signed, and in the family tree that was slowly, but surely, stranding itself. The library of spools is becoming more and more monochrome, and the threads are beginning to fray. The conceptual library of genetics dissolves, and you are back within the cold, echoing walls of the Spanish royal palace. But you are not in the grand throne room or the public galleries. You have been led to the royal nursery. This should be a place of life, of laughter, of hope. But the atmosphere here is heavy with a quiet, perpetual sorrow. The air is still, the curtains are drawn, and the silence is broken only by the soft rustle of a nurse's gown or the hushed, anxious whispers of ladies minus in minus, anxious whispers of ladies minus. This is the hidden, tragic side of the Habsburg dynasty. For all the talk of power and empire, the most urgent and constant struggle was happening right here, in the cradle. The primary, non-negotiable duty of a Habsburg queen was to produce a healthy male, and generation after generation. This simple biological task became an agonizing, heartbreaking ordeal. The genetic echo chamber was having its most devastating effect on the most vulnerable members of the family. You watch as a grim minus-faced royal physician leaves the queen's chambers, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. Another pregnancy has ended in miscarriage, or perhaps the infant was born but lived for only a few hours, a tiny, fragile creature too weak to survive. The ladies minus in minus waiting make the sign of the cross. The king is informed, his face an impassive mask, hiding a deep, dynastic anxiety. And the queen is left to weep in private, knowing that the whispers in the court will blame her, her body, her weakness. Let's be clear about the scale of this problem. It wasn't just one or two unlucky tragedies. It was a statistical pattern. Modern researchers have studied the Habsburg family tree in detail, and the numbers are stark. Looking at the Spanish branch over a period of about 200 years, from the late 15th to the late 17th century, nearly half of all Habsburg children did not survive to the age of 10. That is a staggering rate of infant and child mortality, even for an era that was already harsh. While other royal families in Europe were successfully having 6, 7, or 8 children grow to adulthood, the Spanish Habsburgs struggled to get even one or to pass the perilous years of childhood. And for those who did survive, many were plagued by what was delicately termed a fragile constitution. They were perpetually ill, weak, and susceptible to every passing sickness. The court became a place of constant medical anxiety, a world of potions, bleeding and endless, desperate prayers. Here's a small but telling detail from the time. When a royal birth was approaching, the court would go into a kind of religious frenzy. Relics of saints would be brought into the delivery room. Special prayers would be commissioned. Astrologers would be consulted to find the most auspicious moment for the birth. When Margaret of Austria, the wife of Philip II, was in labor, she was apparently given a special drink containing crushed pearls and other precious substances, which was believed to help produce a strong child. It was a mixture of deep faith and desperate superstition, a sign of a court that knew something was deeply wrong but had no rational way to explain or fix it. They were trying to solve a genetic problem with prayer and potions. Now, historians have long debated the impact of this constant grief and anxiety on the Habsburg rulers themselves. How does it shape a king's personality when he has had to bury most of his own children? Philip II, for all his cold reputation, was by all accounts a loving father who was devastated by the death of Don Carlos and his other children. His successor, Philip II, was known for his deep piety, which some historians suggest was intensified by the constant presence of death in his family. Does this constant private tragedy help explain the stagnation and decline of the Spanish Empire in the 17th century? Some scholars argue yes. They suggest that the kings became more insular, more focused on the spiritual and less on the practical. How can you focus on reforming the tax code or modernizing the navy when your entire world is consumed with the desperate hope that your one sickly son will just survive to his next birthday? That the genetic crisis in the nursery created a political and psychological crisis that radiated outwards, weakening the entire imperial structure. The foundations of the house were crumbling, not from outside attack, but from within the royal bedroom itself. You look around the quiet, opulent nursery. You see the empty cradles, the unused toys. This room, more than any other, is the epicenter of the Habsburg tragedy. It is a place of immense wealth and profound biological poverty. They could conquer the world, command vast armies, and control mountains of silver, but they could not, it seemed, accomplish the one simple, natural task that their dynasty depended on, the creation of a healthy child. You leave the sorrowful quiet of the royal nursery and find yourself walking down a long, formal portrait gallery. On one side, tall windows let in the cool, grey light of Madrid. On the other, hanging against dark red damask, is the entire story of the Spanish Habsburgs, told in oil paint. Here they are, generation after generation, frozen in time, staring out at you with an unnerving, familial similarity. At first you simply see a collection of monarchs, stiff postures, lavish clothes, hands resting on swords or clutching prayer books. The artists' masters like Titian, Velázquez, and Rubens have done their best to portray them with the dignity and majesty befitting their station. But as you walk slowly down the hall, passing from one generation to the next, you begin to see it. You are witnessing a slow motion story of physical decline, painted in plain sight. You start with the early portraits with Charles V. The jaw is there, yes. The prominent chin, the slightly heavy lower lip. It's a strong, stubborn face. A face that ruled the world. In the portraits of his son, Philip II, the feature is more pronounced. The artists have tried to hide it with a neatly trimmed beard, a common trick, but it's unmistakable. He has the serious, slightly melancholic look of a man burdened by immense responsibility. Then you move to the next generation, Philippi I, and here, the change is more noticeable. The face is longer and narrower. The jaw juts out more significantly. The famous Habsburg lip is fuller, almost swollen. There's a passivity in his expression, a lack of the forceful energy you saw in his grandfather. The artists still work their magic, surrounding him with the symbols of power, the golden fleece, the armor, the scepter, but the man inside the costume seems diminished, less vital. And then you arrive at his son, Philip IV. Here, the feature has become the defining characteristic of the face. The jaw is so long, the chin so pronounced, that it creates a sense of profound imbalance. The great court painter, Diego Velázquez, was a genius. He didn't flatter the king. He painted him with a stark, almost brutal honesty, yet somehow managed to preserve his royal dignity. He captures the sad, weary eyes, the pale skin, and that incredible, inescapable jaw, just by looking at the way his mouth is set, that it must have been a physical effort for him to close it completely. The family signature has become a caricature, and the women are not exempt. You see the portraits of the queens, many of them Austrian Habsburgs sent to marry their Spanish cousins. You see the same traits, sometimes softened by more delicate features, but still there. The long face, the heavy jaw. They were Ray minus introducing the very same genetic traits they were supposed to be diluting. Now for a fascinating and slightly quirky detail about these portraits. Art historians have noted that as the Habsburg jaw became more pronounced, the artist developed new strategies to deal with it. Posing the king at a 3-quarter angle was much more flattering than a direct profile. Growing a beard was an excellent way to obscure the severity of the chin. Another subtle trick was to have the king hold something, a glove or letter, a commander's baton, near his face, drawing the viewer's eye away from the jawline. These portraits weren't just art. They were exercises in public relations, a constant, silent negotiation between the painter's honesty and the sitter's deformity. Are we just reading into the past, seeing what we want to see because we know the ending of the story? This is a valid question, and one that historians always have to ask. Are the paintings reliable medical evidence? Perhaps not in a clinical sense. Artists did take liberties. But the consistency of the feature, painted by dozens of different artists over 2 centuries, is impossible to ignore. They were painting what they saw. And what they saw was a family face that was becoming progressively more extreme generation after generation. Some historians argue we should be cautious. They point out that a prominent jaw could have been seen as a sign of masculine strength and determination in that era. Perhaps in the early days it was even admired. But as you continue down the gallery, past Philip IV, you know you are approaching the end of the line. You are approaching the final portrait, the one that Velázquez's less talented successors would have to paint. The culmination of this to -100-year-long unintentional experiment. The portraits on the wall are a silent, powerful testament. They are a visual record of the genetic echo chamber at work. Each canvas is a data point, showing the slow, inexorable amplification of a single flawed inheritance. The family was so proud of its blood, its lineage, but the proof of that lineage, displayed for all to see in these grand, gilded frames, was also the proof of its undoing. The faces in the portrait gallery seem to watch you as you pass, their painted eyes following you down the corridor. You leave the kings behind and turn your attention to the other side of the hall, to the portraits of the queens. Their expressions are often harder to read, pious, demure, constrained by the rigid etiquette of the Spanish court. But behind the stiff lace collars and ropes of pearls, you can sense an immense, unspoken pressure. If the Habsburg nursery was a place of quiet sorrow, the Queen's private chambers were the epicenter of that anxiety. In the deeply patriarchal world of 17th-century Europe, the burden of continuing the dynasty fell squarely, and often cruelly, on the shoulders of the women. You are now a silent observer in this feminized world, a world of ladies -in-waiting, confessors and physicians, all of whom orbit the Queen with one single, all-consuming question: will she produce a healthy son? From the moment a new Habsburg queen arrived at court, often a teenager from the Austrian branch, Married to an uncle or cousin she barely knew, her body became the property of the state. Her monthly cycles were a matter of public record, tracked and discussed by ministers and ambassadors. Every sign of a potential pregnancy was a cause for wild celebration and fervent prayer. Every miscarriage was a state crisis, met with national mourning and, for the Queen, a sense of personal, public failure. Imagine the life of Mariana of Austria, the niece of Philip IV, who was sent to Madrid to become his second wife and queen. She was just a young girl, and he was a weary, aging man. Her entire existence was reduced to this one biological function. She endured multiple pregnancies, watching most of her children die in infancy. You can see the toll it took on her in the famous portraits by Velázquez. He paints her wrapped inside a ridiculously wide court dress, her face pale and sorrowful, her expression one of profound resignation. She is a prisoner of her own fertility and of the failing bloodline she shares with her husband minus uncle. This pressure created a strange and sometimes toxic environment within the palace. The queens were often isolated, surrounded by the rigid Spanish courtiers who watched their every move. They were blamed when they failed to produce an heir, with whispers suggesting it was due to some sin they had committed, or a lack of proper piety. Their diets, their exercise, their very thoughts were policed, all in the desperate hope of ensuring a successful pregnancy. Here's a particularly strange detail that highlights this obsession. It was a common belief at the time that a child's characteristics could be influenced by what the mother saw or experienced during pregnancy. This was called maternal impression. Because of this, a pregnant Habsburg queen's environment was carefully controlled. She would be encouraged to look at beautiful art, to listen to calming music, and most importantly, to gaze upon portraits of handsome saints and strong-minded-looking ancestors. The hope was that these positive images would somehow imprint themselves on the developing fetus. Conversely, she was shielded from anything ugly or upsetting for fear that it would physically mark the child. It's a fascinating, if scientifically baseless, glimpse into their desperate attempts to control a process that was spiraling out of their control. Now historians have a complex and evolving view of these Habsburg queens. For a long time they were seen as little more than passive baby-making machines, tragic figures who had little influence on history. But more recent scholarship has started to push back against this. Historians now emphasize the political power these women could and did wield, especially as regents for their young, often sickly sons. She was a shrewd political operator who ruled the entire Spanish Empire as regent for a decade, navigating treacherous court intrigues and international crises. Was she a brilliant ruler? The consensus is that she was competent and deeply dedicated, but ultimately trapped by an impossible situation. She was fighting to preserve the power of her son, but that son was the living embodiment of the dynasty's genetic collapse. It's an almost unbearably tragic position to be in. Everything you're working to protect is being undermined, but of the person you are trying to save. You look again at the portraits of the queens. You see the piety, the resignation, the sorrow. But now, perhaps, you also see a flicker of something else, a steely resilience, a quiet determination. They were not just passive carriers of a failing bloodline. They were women who had to endure unimaginable personal grief while simultaneously navigating the cutthroat politics of a declining empire. They were blamed for a problem that was not of their making, a problem that had been set in motion generations before they were, by a series of marriage contracts signed by men who could never have imagined the consequences. The weight of it all, the miscarriages, the infant deaths, the sickly children, the future of the empire rested unfairly on them. The rustle of the queen's silk gowns fades into a more ominous sound, the low, urgent chanting of a prayer. The formal portrait gallery dissolves and you find yourself in a much darker, more claustrophobic space, a small private chapel, lit only by the flickering of dozens of beeswax candles. The air is thick with the cloying scent of incense and melting wax. Kneeling before a golden altar is the king himself, his head bowed, his face a mask of desperation. He is not praying for victory in battle or for the prosperity of his kingdom, he is praying for the health of his child. As the genetic crisis deepened, as the nurseries fell silent and the heirs grew weaker, the Habsburg court turned increasingly towards the only explanation that made sense to them, the supernatural. You are now a witness to a world steeped in a profound, and at times terrifying religious fervor. If the problem wasn't in the blood, or at least, not in the way they understood blood, then it must be a punishment from God, or worse, the work of the devil. The Spanish Habsburgs were famously, almost fanatically, devout Catholics. They saw themselves as the sworn defenders of the true faith, locked in a holy war against Protestants, Muslims, and heretics of all kinds. This deep piety, which had been a source of strength and purpose for the dynasty, now became the primary lens through which they interpreted their biological misfortunes. The constant deaths of their children were not a medical problem, they were a spiritual one. They were a sign that God was displeased. And so the court became a theatre of extreme religious observance. The kings and queens subjected themselves to grueling fasts, spent hours a day in prayer, and made enormous donations to churches and monasteries. They sponsored vast processions, where sacred relics were paraded through the streets to ward off sickness and misfortune. The royal palace began to feel less like a center of government and more like a monastery, a place of constant, anxious negotiation with an angry God. But faith has a dark wind, superstition. And as prayers went unanswered, a more sinister explanation began to take hold. Perhaps this wasn't just God's displeasure. Perhaps it was an active malevolence, a curse. The whispers started to shift from sin to sorcery. Had an enemy of the crown, a frustrated courtier, or a foreign power, placed a hex on the royal family? Was there a witch in the palace? Were there demons haunting the royal bedchamber? This is where things get truly strange. The court became obsessed with rooting out any potential source of dark magic. In the case of the final Habsburg king, Charles II, who was sickly from birth, the belief in a supernatural cause was almost universal. Exorcists were brought in to perform elaborate rituals, trying to drive out the demons that they believed were tormenting his frail body. One of the more bizarre and grim remedies attempted involved something called the reshaped, an ancient and very complex medicinal paste. Think of it as a kind of magical energy drink. Its recipe often included dozens of ingredients, including herbs, spices, and most famously viper's flesh, which was thought to be a powerful antidote to poison and dark magic. Giving this strange, sludgy concoction to a chronically ill child was seen as a perfectly rational medical and spiritual treatment. Historians are still untangling the complex relationship between faith, medicine, and magic in the Habsburg court. It's easy for us to dismiss their beliefs as simple ignorance, but that's not quite fair. In their world, the physical and the spiritual were inextricably linked. A doctor might prescribe a bleeding to balance the body's humors, while at the same time a priest would prescribe a novena to appeal to a specific saint. For them, it wasn't a contradiction. It was a two-pronged attack on the problem. Was the turn towards religious and magical explanations a direct cause of the dynasty's decline, or just a symptom of it? This is a point of ongoing debate. Some historians argue that the obsessive focus on piety and the hunt for curses distracted the rulers from the very real political and economic problems their empire was facing. The court was looking for demons in the shadows while the French army was massing on the border. Other scholars suggest this is an oversimplification. They argue that the deep faith of the Habsburgs was a source of comfort and resilience, allowing them to endure a string of tragedies that would have broken a more secular dynasty. You watch as the king finishes his prayer. He rises slowly, his knees stiff. The candles flicker, casting his long, gaunt shadow on the stone wall behind him. There is no relief on his face, only a profound, weary resignation. He has done all he can. He has prayed, he has given alms. He has sought help from the doctors and the priests and the exorcists. But the curse, the sickness, the invisible poison that haunts his family remains. He is fighting a ghost, a phantom that lives not in the chapel, but in the very genes he will pass on to his long-awaited, desperately prayed for son. The heavy, incense-laden air of the chapel gives way to the musty, paper-scented atmosphere of the royal archives. The candlelight is replaced by the dim, flat light of a shuttered window. You are surrounded by shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound ledgers and stacks of official decrees tied up with faded red ribbon. This is the administrative heart of the empire, the place where the day-to-day business of ruling is recorded. But as you look at the documents from the mid-to-late 17th century, you notice a strange quality to them. The handwriting on the royal decrees is often shaky, signatures are missing, decisions are endlessly delayed. You are witnessing the political consequences of the genetic crisis. The problems that began in the royal nursery were now seeping out into the corridors of power, causing a creeping paralysis that was slowly bringing the mighty Spanish Empire to a halt. The kingdom was being ruled by ghosts, not the supernatural demons they feared, but the ghosts of effective leadership. The two kings who presided over Spain's most significant decline were Philippi I and Philippi II. Both were men who, by all accounts, were not unintelligent or lazy. The decisiveness and the robust health required to manage such a vast and complex empire. Philippi I was famously passive and deeply melancholic, a man who preferred prayer and court ceremonies to the tedious work of governance. He essentially outsourced the job of ruling to a powerful chief minister, the Duke of Lerma. This set a dangerous precedent. The king became a figurehead, a sacred symbol who reigned but did not rule. His son, Philippi V, the king immortalized by Velasquez, was more energetic in his youth. But as he aged, worn down by constant military defeats and the endless string of personal tragedies, watching his children and his beloved first wife die, he sank into a deep, depressive lethargy. He too came to rely on a chief minister, the Count minus Duke of Olivares, to run the empire for him. The problem was, while these ministers were often capable and dedicated men, their power was never absolute. They could always be undermined by rival factions at court. Without a strong, decisive king to back them up, their ambitious plans for reform often withered on the vine. And here's a quirky but telling detail about the Spanish court that made this problem even worse. The court was famously, absurdly formal. Etiquette, or protocol, governed every single aspect of daily life. There was a right way and a wrong way to do everything, from how the king should put on his shirt in the morning to who was allowed to hand him a glass of water. One famous, though likely exaggerated, story tells of Philippi I dying from a fever because the specific courtier, whose job it was to move the king's chair away from the roaring fireplace, could not be found in time. While probably not true, the story captures a real sense of a court so obsessed with form and ritual that it was losing its ability to function in the real world. A system like this needs a powerful, engaged monarch at its center to make it work. With weak or disengaged kings, the whole machine simply ground to a halt in a flurry of pointless ceremony. Now historians have long debated the Spanish decline. Was it all the fault of these inbred, ineffective kings? For a long time, this was the standard explanation. The story was simple: strong kings like Charles V built the empire, and weak kings like Philippi I and IV let it crumble. But modern historians have a much more nuanced view. They argue that the kings were only one part of a much bigger picture. They point to huge, systemic problems: a backwards economy dependent on colonial silver rather than domestic industry, a series of costly and unwinnable wars, and the rise of powerful new rivals like France and the Netherlands. In this view, the tragedy of the later Habsburgs was not that they caused the decline, but that they were uniquely unequipped to stop it. Spain needed a dynamic, revolutionary leader to pull it out of its nosedive, and the genetic lottery kept giving it men who were physically and psychologically fragile, men who were more suited to a monastery than a throne room. Were they personally to blame? Or were they just the final, unlucky inheritors of a system that was already broken and a bloodline that was already spent? The debate continues, but it's clear their personal limitations had a profound impact. You look back at the dusty archives. You see a report from a provincial governor begging for funds to repair a collapsing bridge. You see a desperate plea from a general on the front lines, asking for more troops. You see a proposal for economic reform, full of brilliant ideas. And on each document, you see the scrawled notation, awaiting the king's pleasure. And you realize that in this kingdom, ruled by ghosts and governed by ritual, the king's pleasure might never arrive. The paperwork just keeps piling up, gathering dust, a silent monument to an empire slowly seizing up from the head down. The dusty silence of the archives dissolves. The scent of old paper is replaced by the smell of antiseptic herbs and stale clothes minus off air. You are in the royal birthing chamber, a room that has seen so much sorrow. But today is different. There is a palpable tension, a fragile, terrifying hope. The year is 1661. Mariana of Austria, the queen you saw in the portraits, the wife and niece of King Philip IV, has just given birth. It is a boy. He is the last drop. After so many miscarriages, stillbirths and infant deaths, he is the only surviving male heir. The entire future of the Spanish Empire, a global dominion stretching from Madrid to Manila, now rests on the impossibly tiny shoulders of this one baby. And from the very first moment, it is terrifyingly clear that something is profoundly wrong. You don't see the baby yourself, not yet. You only hear the whispers, the horrified, hushed tones of the physicians and the midwives as they rush in and out of the chamber. You see a lady waiting emerge, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear she is trying desperately to conceal. The celebratory bells that should be ringing all across Madrid are silent. The official announcements are delayed. The court holds its breath, waiting, praying. The reports that begin to trickle out are grim. The baby is small, weak, and afflicted with a host of ailments. He suffers from fevers, convulsions, and constant digestive problems. His head is disproportionately large for his tiny, frail body. And he bears the family signature, the Habsburg jaw, in its most extreme and debilitating form. He is so fragile, so delicate, that no one, not his parents, not the anxious ambassadors sending secret reports back to their own courts, expects him to survive his first week. Every day of his infancy is a crisis. The royal nursery is transformed into a sick room, a fortress against the slightest draught or the faintest noise. He is swaddled in blankets and furs, even in the heat of the Spanish summer. His diet is a constant source of anxiety and debate. Wet nurses are hired and fired with alarming frequency, each one blamed when the prince's delicate stomach inevitably rejects their milk. The best doctors in the kingdom can do little more than watch, and pray, and apply useless salves and potions. Here's a small, heartbreaking detail that illustrates the desperation. In an attempt to ward off the evil spirits they believed were plaguing the infant, his cradle was surrounded by an astonishing collection of sacred relics. They laid in his bed pieces of wood supposedly from the true cross, bones of saints, and scraps of clothing worn by holy figures. They were trying to build a supernatural force field around this child, to protect him with the accumulated holiness of centuries. When he did miraculously cling to life day after day, was not seen as a medical outcome, but as a testament to the power of these relics and the fervent prayers of the kingdom. Historians and geneticists now have a clear picture of Charles II's condition, and it's a devastating one. He was the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding. His inbreeding coefficient, as we discussed, was a staggering 0.254, higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. This genetic collapse likely resulted in a host of problems. It's now believed he suffered from at least 2 distinct genetic disorders, combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature and developmental delays, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that can cause a host of metabolic problems. But was he just a collection of symptoms? Or was there a person inside that frail body? This is a question that historians who study Charles II grapple with. It's easy to see him as a medical curiosity, a grotesque symbol of his family's decay. But he was also a human being. A child who was constantly sick, constantly prodded and examined, surrounded by anxious, weeping adults. A boy who would grow up knowing, on some level, that he was a profound disappointment, a failed king, the last sputtering ember of a once great fire. For now, though, he is just a baby. A tiny, struggling infant in a lavishly decorated room, fighting for every breath. His father, the old and weary Philip IV, comes to look at him, his face a mixture of hope and utter despair. He has prayed his whole life for a son and heir, and this is the answer to his prayers. The dynasty has finally produced a male heir, who looks likely to survive infancy. But as Philip looks at his son, this child who represents the last drop of his family's bloodline. He must have wondered if the answer to his prayers was, in fact, the final, most terrible phase of the curse. The anxious, hushed atmosphere of the sick room minus nursery slowly expands to encompass the entire palace. The years pass, and against all odds, the young prince, Charles, survives. But he does not grow. He does not develop. He is less a child and more a precious, impossibly fragile object, something to be preserved at all costs. You are now a witness to one of the strangest childhoods in royal history. He is a king, but he is trapped in a prison of no expectations. His father, Philip IV, dies when Charles is just 3 years old. He is now Charles II, King of Spain and all its dominions. But of course he cannot rule. His mother, Mariana of Austria, becomes the regent, the ruler of the empire. And her primary policy, the guiding principle that overrides everything else, is the absolute preservation of her son's physical health. The boy who was wrapped in cotton wool as an infant is now wrapped in a metaphorical version of it as a king. He is not taught to read or write until he is well into his teens. The reason? His tutors and his mother fear that the mental strain of concentrating on matters might be too much for his delicate constitution. He is not expected to engage in any physical activity. Riding, fencing, even walking too much are all considered dangerously strenuous. He is often carried from place to place, like a porcelain doll. His diet is meticulously, obsessively controlled, yet he remains rail-minus, thin and perpetually sick. His days are a monotonous, empty routine. He is dressed by attendants. He is dressed by attendants. He is taken to mass where he sits, vacant to formal audiences, where he is displayed to ambassadors and nobles, a silent, pathetic symbol of the kingdom he is supposed to lead. No one challenges him. No one tries to educate him or stimulate his mind. The court's entire approach to raising the king is based on a single, terrifying fear that the slightest effort, the slightest stress might cause him to break. Here's a particularly telling and poignant detail. Charles was not weaned from a wet nurse until he was around 5 or 6 years old, an unusually late age even for the time. And for much of his childhood, his primary companions were not other children or learned tutors, but court dwarfs and jesters. In the strange, inverted world of the Spanish court, these were often the only people who could interact with the king without the suffocating formality that surrounded everyone else. They were his playmates, his friends in a world where he was otherwise completely isolated. It was a childhood devoid of learning, of discipline, of friendship, of any of the normal experiences that shape a human being. What was the effect of all this on Charles's mind? This is a question historians find both fascinating and deeply sad. It's almost certain that his cognitive development was severely impaired by his genetic conditions. He was likely intellectually disabled from birth, but it is equally certain that his upbringing made the problem infinitely worse. A mind that was already struggling was given no education, no reason to grow. He was raised to be passive, ignorant, and completely dependent. Was this a deliberate plot by his mother Mariana to keep him weak so that she could continue to rule as regent? Some of her political enemies at the time certainly made this accusation. They claimed she was intentionally keeping her son an infant so that she could hold on to power. Most historians today, however, have a more sympathetic view. They see her not as a power-hungry villain, but as a terrified and overprotective mother. Her entire world, and the entire future of the dynasty, rested on this one flickering flame of her life. Her smothering, misguided parenting was likely born not of ambition, but of a deep, profound, and understandable fear. She had already buried so many children. She was desperate not to lose this one too. You watch him now, a boy of 10. He is sitting on a huge throne, his little legs dangling far from the floor. The crown is too big for his head. He stares blankly into the middle distance as a minister reads a long, boring report about tax revenues in a distant province. He doesn't understand the words. He doesn't know what a tax is, or where that province is. He is the absolute monarch of a global empire, and he has been so carefully protected, so thoroughly shielded from the world, that he knows almost nothing at all. He is a king who has never been taught how to be a person. The image of the small, vacant boy on the oversized throne blurs and he slowly grows into a young man. But it's not the vigorous, confident transformation you'd expect of a prince coming of age. Instead, it's a painful, difficult process like a withered plant struggling to grow in barren soil. You are seeing Charles II in his late teens and 20s, a man in body but still a child in so many ways. And you are now forced to look directly at the full, devastating consequences of his inheritance. You see him attempting to walk through the grand halls of the palace. His gait is unsteady, shuffling. His legs thin and weak, often tremble and threaten to buckle. He is tall, but stooped, his body seemingly unable to properly support its own weight. Then you hear him try to speak. This is perhaps the most difficult thing to witness. The Habsburg jaw, in him, has reached its most extreme and debilitating form. His mandible is so pronounced, his lower jaw so overgrown, that his teeth cannot meet at all. This condition, known as a severe malocclusion, made chewing an almost impossible, tortuous act. Food had to be swallowed with minimal chewing, leading to constant stomach ailments. And it made speech a thick, wet, barely intelligible mumble. His tongue was said to be unusually large, further compounding the problem. For a king whose job involves issuing commands, holding audiences, and speaking with foreign dignitaries, this was a catastrophic disability. To understand their monarch, courtiers had to lean in close, straining to decipher the slurry of words, and then pretend they had understood perfectly. And you see his face, the long, narrow face, the pale, almost translucent skin, the famous Habsburg lip, now so large and droopy it hangs open, allowing drool to sometimes escape, and his eyes, which painters always tried to imbue with a sense of royal dignity, often held a look of dull, placid confusion. He was a man whose own body was a prison, a collection of inherited deformities that made the simplest acts of living, walking, eating, talking a daily, humiliating struggle. He is a truly bizarre detail that comes not from a court gossip, but from an official ambassadorial report. An English envoy, Alexander Stanhope, sent a brutally honest physical description of Charles II back to London. He noted that the king's body was as extenuated as a skeleton and made a shocking observation: he has a ravenous stomach, and swallows all he eats whole, for he has neither jostled and so much out, that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. This was a physical reality so obvious that it was being reported as geopolitical intelligence to foreign governments. The health of this one broken body was a matter of international concern. The people of Spain, the common folk, did not see the king up close. They saw him only in official portraits or as a distant figure in a royal procession. But they knew something was wrong. They could see the decline of their country, the military defeats, the economic hardship. And they looked at their king, this strange, sickly figure, and they tried to find an explanation that made sense in their world. And the one they settled on was witchcraft. This is when he acquired the nickname that would follow him through history, Carlos el Hikais Eidu, Charles the Bewitched. It was a perfect explanation for an age that did not understand genetics. It explained everything. His physical deformities were the devil's mark. His infertility was the result of a spell. His mental deficiencies were the work of a demon occupying his mind. His mother, the regent Mariana, was even accused of having bewitched him herself to maintain her power. The belief was so widespread that it became a matter of state. One famous exorcist spent years examining the king, finally concluding that he was indeed bewitched, the victim of a curse placed on him as an infant. Historians today see this as a classic case of a society finding a supernatural explanation for a biological reality it cannot comprehend. Was Charles bewitched? In a way, yes. But the spell was not cast by a witch over a cauldron. It was cast generations earlier, in a series of royal wedding chapels. The curse was not demonic, it was genetic. It was carried in the very blood that was supposed to be his greatest source of pride and power. You see him now sitting through another long, tedious council meeting. He doesn't speak, he just listens, his mouth slightly agape, his gaze distant. The ministers around the table argue about policy, their voices rising and falling. They are the ones who truly run the kingdom. He is just a spectator, a living relic, the bewitched king, held captive not by a demon, but by the inescapable legacy of his own ancestors. The solemn, stagnant air of the council chamber dissolves, and you find yourself once again in the private, anxious world of the royal bedchamber. But it is not the nursery this time. Charles is a man now, and he is married. The entire focus of the Spanish court, and indeed of all the courts of Europe, has narrowed to this one, single, intimate question. Can the king produce an heir? The survival of the dynasty, the fate of the empire, the balance of power on the entire continent, it all comes down to this. The search for a successor becomes the final agonizing and deeply public drama of the Spanish Habsburgs. His first wife is a French princess, the young and vibrant Marie-Louise of Orleans. She is a niece of the powerful King Louis XVI of France, and the marriage is a major political event designed to ease tensions between the two rival powers. She arrives in Spain, a lively, intelligent young woman, and enters the suffocating, grim and formal world of the Madrid court. And she is married to Charles. You can only imagine the shock and perhaps pity she must have felt. But by all accounts, she was a kind and dutiful wife. And Charles, in his own way, seemed to be genuinely devoted to her. He followed her around the palace like a lost child, showing a desperate, touching affection. The court watched them, dissecting their every interaction, looking for any sign, any whisper that the queen might be pregnant. Months turned into years. The couple went on pilgrimages to fertility shrines. They tried folk remedies and strange medical concoctions. The queen's body was subjected to endless humiliating examinations by royal physicians, but nothing happened. The royal bed remained barren. After 10 years of this relentless pressure, the young queen, still childless, fell ill and died. On her deathbed, she reportedly whispered to her grieving husband, "Your Majesty, I may have many women, but none who will love you as I have." The court and the king were devastated. But the dynastic need was too great to allow for a long period of mourning. An heir must be produced. And so a second wife is found. This time they turn back to the traditional source, a German princess from the Austrian branch of the family, Maria Anna of Neuburg. If the French bride couldn't produce a Habsburg heir, perhaps a German one, closer in blood, could. The cycle begins again. The new queen arrives. The court watches. The pressure mounts. But the result is the same. The years pass, and the nursery remains empty. The new queen, a more politically ambitious and less gentle figure than her predecessor, becomes deeply frustrated. She reportedly fakes pregnancies to gain political influence, only to be humiliatingly exposed when no child appears. The court becomes a snake pit of rival factions, with the French party and the Austrian party constantly scheming, each hoping to position their favored candidate to inherit the throne when the inevitable happens. Here's a strange and rather grim detail from this period. In their desperation, the king and his advisors turned back to the supernatural. A team of the most prominent exorcists in Spain, the Junta of Exorcists, was assembled. They subjected the king to a series of humiliating and stressful rituals. They also began a bizarre investigation, trying to determine the exact nature of the curse they believed was upon him. They even had the body of his ancestor, the Emperor Charles V, exhumed, believing that some lingering spiritual issue might reside there. It was a court in the grip of a complete moral and intellectual panic. Why couldn't Charles have children? For centuries the blame was placed squarely on him, on his deformed and broken body. It was assumed he was impotent. Modern science, however, offers a more precise and even sadder explanation. Looking at his array of likely genetic disorders, it is almost certain he was sterile. The combined pituitary hormone deficiency would have left him organs, and the other syndromes would have contributed to his infertility. It was not a lack of effort, or a curse, or the wrong choice of wife. It was a simple, brutal, biological fact written into his genes. He was born sterile. The dynasty had finally, literally, bred itself into a dead end. Historians debate whether Charles himself ever understood this. Did he feel a sense of personal failure, of shame? Or was he too cognitively impaired to fully grasp the situation? It's impossible to know. We only have the accounts of those around him who describe a man growing increasingly melancholic and passive, a puppet king buffeted by the schemes of his wife and his ministers. He was the center of everyone's attention, the most important man in the world, and yet he was also completely irrelevant to the central question of his own reign. The search for an heir had nothing, in the end, to do with him at all. The claustrophobic, incense-filled air of the royal bedroom gives way to a drafty, more open space. You are in a grand salon, but the mood is anything but festive. The windows are closed drawn. Maps are spread across tables, not of the Spanish Empire, but of Europe. You are no longer just an observer in the Spanish court, you are now sensing the vibrations from across the continent. Every diplomat, every minister, every king from London to Vienna, from Paris to The Hague, is watching Madrid. They are watching one man's health, waiting for one man's last breath. The childless dying king has become the most dangerous man in Europe. Not because of his weakness, his impending death, and the vast, leaderless empire he will leave behind, is a political vacuum of such immense size that it threatens to suck the entire continent into a catastrophic war. You can feel the tension in the air, a low hum of anxiety and rapacious greed. The vultures of Europe are circling. Who has the best claim to the Spanish throne? This is the question that consumes every cabinet and council in Europe. The family tree, that twisted, inward-looking wreath, now becomes the subject of intense international scrutiny. The lines of inheritance are a tangled mess. On one side, you have the Austrian Habsburgs. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, is Charles's cousin. He argues that the Spanish throne is a Habsburg possession, and it should naturally stay within the family. It should pass to his younger son, ensuring the continuation of the great Habsburg alliance. His claim is strong, rooted in generations of shared blood and treaties. But on the other side, you have the most powerful and ambitious king in Europe, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His claim is just as strong, if not stronger, through his wife. He had married a Spanish princess, Maria Theresa, who was Charles I's own half-sister. According to the laws of succession, their children and grandchildren have an incredibly direct and legitimate claim to the throne. When they married, Maria had officially renounced her right to the Spanish throne, but that renunciation was contingent on Spain paying a massive dowry, a dowry which was never ever paid. Louis XIV now argues with a certain ruthless logic that since the dowry was unpaid, the renunciation is void. So you have two colossal powers, the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, both with legitimate, defensible claims to the entire Spanish inheritance. And neither side is willing to let the other have it. The prize is simply too great. If the French were to inherit Spain, they would control a super-minor state stretching from the Netherlands to Sicily, dominating Europe and the Americas. If the Austrians were to inherit, the old empire of Charles V would essentially be recreated, once again surrounding France with a ring of Habsburg steel. The balance of power, the delicate equilibrium that keeps the continent from constant, all-consuming warfare, is about to be shattered. Here's a quirky detail of the diplomacy of this era. Espionage wasn't just about stealing military secrets. The most valuable intelligence coming out of Madrid was medical gossip. Ambassadors became amateur doctors paying huge bribes to courtiers, chambermaids, and even the king's physicians to get the latest updates on Charles's health. Was his appetite good today? Did he have a fever? How was his digestion? Every fluctuation in the king's bodily functions was reported back to Paris or Vienna in coded dispatches, where it was analyzed by ministers trying to predict exactly how much longer they had to prepare for the inevitable war. This period is known to historians as the long deathbed of Charles II. For years, Europe held its breath. Secret treaties were drawn up between the great powers, trying to find a peaceful solution. Their favorite idea was partition. They would carve up the Spanish Empire like a cake, giving a piece to the French claimant, a piece to the Austrian, and keeping a piece for themselves, just for good measure. But historians still debate the wisdom of these plans. Were they a genuine attempt to avoid war, or were they a cynical landmine grabbed by powerful nations who saw Spain as too weak to defend itself? Charles II, for all his infirmities, was outraged when he learned of these secret plans to dismember his inheritance. He may have been a weak king, but he was determined that the empire he had inherited whole would be passed on whole. You can feel the palace in Madrid becoming a battleground. The dying king is caught in a vicious tug-minus war between the pro-Austrian faction, led by his German wife, and the pro-French faction, led by a powerful cardinal. They whisper in his ear, they bully him, they try to trick him into signing documents. The fate of the world is being decided in a sick man's bedroom, and the vultures are no longer just circling. They have landed on the roof, their claws scraping on the tiles, waiting. The tense, conspiratorial atmosphere of the psalm intensifies. You are no longer just an observer of the schemas, you are now in the very room where the final act is playing out. The dying king's bedchamber. The air is stale, thick with the smell of sickness and unwashed linens. Charles' eye is propped up on a mountain of pillows, his breathing shallow and dragged. He is barely conscious, a flickering candle in a hurricane of political intrigue. Surrounding the bed are the key players in this final, desperate drama. His wife, Queen Maria Anna, her face a hard mask of ambition and anxiety, representing the Austrian cause. The powerful Cardinal Portocarrero, the Archbishop of Toledo, his deep voice a constant, persuasive rumble in the king's ear, arguing for the French succession. And a host of doctors, priests and secretaries, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. They are all here for one thing, the will, the single most important document in the world. For months, the pressure on the dying king has been relentless. The factions had battled, bribed, and threatened their way to his bedside. Charles, caught in the middle, has agonized. His instincts, his entire family history, screamed for him to name his Austrian cousin as his heir. He was a Habsburg. The throne should go to a Habsburg, but he was also the King of Spain, and his advisors, led by the shrewd Cardinal Portocarrero, have been relentlessly making a different case, a case based on cold hard geopolitical reality. The Cardinal's argument is simple and brutal. Your Majesty, you can almost hear him whisper, if you name the Austrians as your heirs, the French will invade. And Austria is far away. Their armies will be slow to arrive. We will not be able to defend ourselves. Spain will become a battlefield, torn apart and dismembered. But if you name the French claimant, the grandson of Louis XIV, as your heir, then the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, will use his entire army to defend your empire, to keep it united and whole, just as you wish. It is an argument of pure pragmatism over blood loyalty. You watch as a secretary brings the final version of the will to the bedside. A pen is placed in the king's trembling hand. He is so weak he can barely hold it. A notary reads the key clause aloud, his voice echoing in the still, tense room. The heir to the entire, undivided Spanish Empire is to be Philip of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. With that, a dynasty that had defined itself for centuries by its hatred of the French, that had fought countless wars against them, signs its own throne away to its greatest enemy. It is a moment of breathtaking irony. The Habsburg obsession with keeping their inheritance together has led them to this. The only way to save the inheritance is to give it to someone else. Now for a fascinating historical what if. What if Charles had refused? What if, in a final act of family loyalty, he had signed a will naming the Austrian Archduke as his heir? This is one of history's great counterfactuals, and historians love to debate it. Would Louis XIV have simply invaded and conquered Spain? Almost certainly. Would the Austrian Habsburgs and their allies have been able to stop him? Perhaps, but the ensuing war would have been fought on Spanish soil, devastating the kingdom. Cardinal Portocarrero's grim prediction was probably correct. In a sense, Charles II, in his last ever political act, may have made the most rational choice available, choosing the path he thought would cause the least amount of destruction to his own kingdom. Was it a betrayal of his family, or his ultimate act of duty as a king? It's a question with no easy answer. The pen scratches across the parchment. Charles signs his name. The deed is done. A few weeks later, on November 1st, 1700, just a few days short of his 39th birthday, Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, is dead. The news ripples out from Madrid like a shockwave. A French diplomat gallops for the border, carrying a copy of the will. When the news reaches the French court at Versailles, Louis XIV is said to have presented his grandson to the assembled courtiers with the triumphant words, "Gentlemen, behold the King of Spain." A new dynasty, the Bourbons, is now on the Spanish throne, a dynasty that continues to this day. The Sun King has achieved a victory through a single signature that his armies could never have won on the battlefield. The Spanish Habsburgs are finished. The line has gone extinct. But the story is not quite over, because a will, after all, is just a piece of paper, and the rest of Europe is not about to let this colossal transfer of power happen without a fight. The king is dead. Long live the war. The suffocating stillness of the royal death chamber gives way to a shocking, brutal noise, the sound of a cannon firing. Then another, and another, and another, and another. The final signature on the will was not an end, but a beginning. You are no longer in the secretive corridors of the palace, but on the vast, muddy, blood-soaked chessboard of Europe. The private, biological tragedy of the Habsburg family has now exploded into a very public, very violent, international catastrophe. The conflict that erupts is known as the War of the Spanish Succession. It is a true world war, a decade-long struggle that will rage from the fields of Germany to the mountains of Italy, from the shores of Spain to the colonies in the Americas. It is a war of almost unimaginable complexity, with shifting alliances and a dizzying cast of characters. But at its heart, the cause is simple. The rest of Europe, particularly England, the Netherlands, and the Austrian Habsburgs, are absolutely terrified of the idea of a united French and Spanish super-state. They form a grand alliance to prevent it, and they are willing to burn the continent to the ground to achieve their goal. On one side, you have the French and their new Spanish allies fighting to uphold the will of Charles II. On the other, you have the Grand Alliance, supporting the claim of the Austrian Habsburg candidate, the Archduke Charles II of Spain. Two different men are now claiming to be the King of Spain, and the question will be decided not by lawyers, but by legendary generals like the English Duke of Marlborough and the French Marshal Villars. In a series of epic, bloody battles with names that will echo through history, Blenheim, Ramillies, Malplaquet, you find yourself in the middle of this chaos, a silent observer to the sheer human cost of this dynastic squabble. You see the lines of infantry, clad in their bright red and blue and white coats, marching in perfect formation into a hail of musket fire. You see the cavalry charges, a thunderous, terrifying wave of men and horses crashing into a wall of bayonets. You see the siege warfare, where cities are solved into submission and their walls are blasted into rubble by cannonballs. The inheritance of a single, sterile king is being paid for with the lives of hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers and civilians. Here's a small, curious detail that brings the absurdity of it all into focus. In Spain itself, a brutal civil war breaks out. The region of Castile largely supports the new French king, Philip V. But the region of Catalonia, with its own distinct culture and a long history of resisting the central government in Madrid, fiercely supports the Austrian claimant, Charles. So while the great powers are fighting over the Spanish Empire, the Spanish are fighting each other. Street by street, village by street, village by village by village by village. It's a bitter, internal struggle that will leave deep scars on the nation for centuries to come. Now, historians have long debated the true legacy of this war. Was it really a war about the principles of succession and the legitimacy of a will? Or was that just a convenient excuse? Most modern historians would argue that the war was, at its core, about the balance of power. This was a new and crucial concept in European diplomacy. The idea was that no single nation should ever be allowed to become so powerful that it could dominate all the others. The War of the Spanish Succession was the first great test of this idea. It was a brutal, continent-wide effort to contain the ambition of Louis XIV's France and maintain a fragile equilibrium. So, who won? In a way, everyone. After more than a decade of fighting, the exhausted nations finally came to the negotiating table. The peace treaty, the Treaty of Utrecht, is a masterpiece of political compromise. The French candidate Philip V is confirmed as the King of Spain. So, France wins. And this is a huge, but the treaty explicitly states that the crowns of France and Spain must never be united. The two kingdoms must remain separate. So, the Grand Alliance wins. To compensate the Austrian Habsburgs for losing the grand prize of Spain, they are given most of Spain's former territories in Italy and the Netherlands. England, for its part, gets strategic naval bases like Gibraltar and Minorca, and lucrative trading rights in the Spanish Americas. The Spanish Empire is partitioned after all, just as the secret treaties had planned. The war that was fought to prevent the dismemberment of the empire ends with its dismemberment of the empire ends with its dismemberment. The final irony is that Charles I's will was both upheld and completely defied. The war ends not with a grand victory, but with a weary, pragmatic redrawing of the map. The bloodbath is over. The balance of power is restored, and the Spanish Habsburg dynasty is now well and truly a thing of the past. The smoke of the battlefield clears. The ink on the Treaty of Utrecht is dry. The grand continent spanning drama is over. You find yourself back in a quiet, reflective space, a place for post-mortems and final reckonings. It is time to visit the body. You are in a crypt deep beneath the imposing structure of the Escorial Palace. It is the royal pantheon, the final resting place of the Spanish monarchs. The air is cold, still, and silent. In a series of ornate, gilded sarcophagi, they lie in eternal repose. Charles V. Philippi I, Philippi I, Philippi I, Philippi I, and here, at the end of the line, is the tomb of Charles II, the man they called the Bewitched. But we are not here for a spiritual visit. We are here to listen to the testimony of a doctor. Shortly after Charles's death, as was customary for a monarch, a formal autopsy was performed. It was led by the royal physician, a man named Doctor. He and his team opened the king's body to determine the cause of death and to prepare it for embalming. And what they found, and what they found, and what they found, and what they found, and what dotted, in his official report, is one of the most shocking and visceral documents in medical history. His report is not written in the cool, detached language of modern science. It is the testimony of a 17th-century man trying to make sense of a body that seemed to defy nature. You can almost hear his astonished voice as he dictates his findings. He reported that the king's heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were but active and gangrenous. He had a single solitary testicle, black as coal, and his head, when opened, was found to be full of water. Now, we must be cautious. This is a 17th-century medical report. A mere understanding of anatomy was not what it is today. The language is dramatic, perhaps exaggerated for effect. But even allowing for that, the picture it paints is of a body that was a complete and catastrophic systemic failure. It was not just one organ that had failed, the entire system had collapsed. He was, from a biological standpoint, a man whose body was barely viable. A collection of malfunctioning parts that had somehow managed to keep going for 30-8 years through sheer stubborn persistence. And here is a truly macabre little detail. The autopsy of Charles I was not the only royal body to be examined. A century later, during the Napoleonic Wars, French soldiers would break into this very crypt and desecrate the royal tombs. An official who was present when the tombs were later restored left a written account of what he saw. He noted that the body of Charles II, unlike the others which had decayed into skeletons, was still remarkably well preserved, almost mummified. Even then, the famously long jaw and the fragile, bird-like bones. A strange, final testament to a body that was unusual in death as it had been in life. For the doctors at the time of the autopsy, the findings confirmed what they had long suspected. The king had been the victim of witchcraft, his insides rotted by a demonic curse. For modern scientists, Dr. Khan's report is something else entirely. It is Exhibit A in the case against generational inbreeding. The peppercorn heart, perhaps a sign of congenital heart defects. The corroded lungs, the result of a lifetime of respiratory infections that his weak immune system couldn't fight off. Blackened testicle, a clear sign of the hormonal and developmental problems that caused his sterility. The water in his head, likely hydrocephalus, a condition oft unlinked to genetic disorders. Historians still debate the precise interpretation of this single document. How much is medical fact and how much is Baroque religious minus infused description? But what is not in doubt is the conclusion. The autopsy report is the final grim, full stop at the end of the Dynasty story. It is the physical evidence of the genetic dead and they had bred themselves into. The poison they had been cultivating in their own blood for 2 centuries had finally done its work, leaving behind a husk of a body that was, in the doctor's memorable and chilling phrase, a rotten corpse even in life. You look at the cold, silent sarcophagus. The great ambition of the Habsburgs had been to control kingdoms, to master the world through strategic marriages. But they had failed to master the simple, ruthless laws of biology. And this tomb, and the ravaged body that lies within it, is the final receipt for that failure. You leave the cold, silent crypt of the Spanish kings and travel north, across the Pyrenees and the Rhine, to the other half of the story. You find yourself in Vienna, the magnificent capital of the Austrian Habsburgs. The city is vibrant, filled with the triumphant sounds of Baroque music and the clatter of construction. Palaces are being built. Armies are celebrating victories. Here, the story is not one of decay and extinction. Here, the dynasty survived. This is the great, contrasting epilogue to the Spanish tragedy. While their Spanish cousins were spiraling into a genetic dead end, the Austrian branch of the family endured. They would continue to rule a vast Central European empire for another 200 years, right up until the end of the First World War in 1918. The question is why? How did this branch of the family manage to avoid the same catastrophic fate? The answer is a complex mix of luck, circumstance, and a subtle but crucial difference in strategy. You are now an observer in the Hofburg Palace, watching the Austrian emperors and their advisors. And you notice that while they too often married within the family, the pattern was never quite as intense or as relentlessly insular as it was in Spain. Firstly, they had two. The Austrian Habsburgs, as Holy Roman Emperors, were deeply enmeshed in the complex politics of Germany. They needed to make marriage alliances with the powerful German princely families, the rulers of Bavaria, Saxony, and others to maintain their political influence. This forced them to marry out more often, bringing fresh, unrelated genetic material into their bloodline. Their political reality demanded a more diverse marriage strategy than the one pursued by their isolated Spanish relatives. Secondly, they simply got lucky. While the Austrian branch certainly had its share of infant mortality and sickly rulers, they never suffered the same catastrophic cascade of sterility that doomed the Spanish line. They managed, sometimes just barely, to keep producing male heirs. One key moment came in the early 18th century, right after the War of the Spanish Succession. The Emperor Charles I found himself in the exact same position as his Spanish cousin. He had no male heirs, only a daughter, Maria Theresa. But instead of letting this lead to another succession crisis, he spent his entire reign engaged in a massive diplomatic effort to get all the powers of Europe to agree to accept his daughter as his successor. It worked more or less, and Maria Theresa would go on to become one of the most powerful and successful rulers in the family's entire history, producing 16 children and securing the dynasty for generations to come. But this is a crucial, but they did not escape the genetic consequences entirely. The jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was still very much a part of their inheritance. Here's a fascinating and slightly comical detail. The jaw became so associated with the Austrian imperial family that it was sometimes referred to as the Austrian lip. You can see it in the portraits of Maria Theresa and in her famous daughter, Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France. And it continued right down to the very last emperors. One famous photograph of the final Austro-Hungarian emperor, Charles I, shows him in profile, and the unmistakable family chin is as prominent as it was in his ancestors 300 years earlier. Historians who study the Habsburgs often debate this two-branches narrative. Was the Austrian survival really due to a more intelligent strategy, or was it just dumb luck? The consensus is that it was a combination. The political necessity of marrying German princesses provided a crucial, if unintentional, genetic safety valve, and the simple good fortune of Maria Theresa's robust fertility at a critical moment saved them from the brink. They sailed much closer to the edge than they probably ever realized. The Austrian story is a crucial control group for the Spanish experiment. It shows that the Habsburg strategy of intermarriage was not automatically a death sentence. But it was always a dangerous game of chance. The Spanish branch played that game with a desperate, reckless intensity, doubling down generation after generation until their luck inevitably ran out. The Austrians played the same game, but with a little more caution, and a lot more luck. They managed to pull back from the abyss that had completely consumed their cousins. They survived, but they carried the physical mark of their family's peculiar and dangerous habit right to the very end. The grand palaces of Vienna fade, replaced by a modern, sterile, and quiet laboratory. The flickering candlelight has become a cool, steady fluorescent glow. The ancient, leather-bound chronicles have been replaced by the hum of a computer and the precise clicking of scientific instruments. You are in the present day witnessing the final, definitive chapter of the Habsburg story, a chapter written not by historians, but by geneticists. In the early 2000s, a team of Spanish scientists decided to move beyond portraits and autopsy reports. They wanted to see if they could find a precise, mathematical answer to the question of the Habsburg decline. They couldn't exhume the royal bodies for DNA analysis, of course. But they had the next best thing, the incredibly detailed family trees that the Habsburgs themselves had so meticulously kept. You watch as the scientists, led by a researcher named Gonzalo Alvarez, feed this information into a powerful computer program. They create a massive, sprawling family tree, tracing the lineage of the Spanish Habsburgs over 16 generations, involving more than 3,000 individuals. They are not just looking at names and dates. They are using the family tree as a genetic map, a way to calculate, with stunning precision, the effects of centuries of inbreeding. Their key tool is that concept we touched on earlier, the inbreeding coefficient. Remember, it's a number that represents the probability that an individual has inherited two identical copies of a gene from a common ancestor. A higher number means a higher degree of inbreeding. The results that appear on the computer screen are stark and damning. The scientists chart the coefficient for each of the Spanish Habsburg kings. It starts low with Philip the Handsome at a fairly normal 0.0 to 5th. Then, with each generation of uncle minus niece and cousin minus cousin marriage, the number climbs relentlessly. Philippi is higher still. Philippi is higher. Philippi is higher still. Philippi is higher still. Philippi is higher still. And then they get to the end of the line, Charles Eyre. But the scientists didn't stop there. They did something brilliant. They cross-minus referenced these inbreeding coefficients with the known survival rates of Habsburg children. And they found a direct, chilling, statistical correlation. The higher a Habsburg king's inbreeding coefficient was, the lower the chances were that his children would survive. The science perfectly mirrored the tragic story you've been witnessing. The data proved that the curse was real, and it was measurable. Here's a fascinating detail that emerged from their research. The study, which was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, identified not one, but two likely genetic disorders that were passed down through the family as a result of the inbreeding. They pinpointed the pituitary hormone deficiency in the kidney, disorder we discussed earlier, as the most probable culprits for Charles II's host of health problems and his sterility. For the first time, the bewitched king had a specific, scientific diagnosis for his suffering. The ghosts of superstition were finally banished by the clear light of genetic analysis. Now historians have had to reckon with this new scientific evidence. Does it change the story? Not the basic facts, no. But it adds a layer of profound, inescapable certainty. The debate is no longer about whether inbreeding was the cause of the Spanish Habsburgs' extinction. The science has proven that it was. The debate now is about the subtleties. How did the Habsburgs themselves perceive what was happening? How did their biological crisis interact with the political, economic, and religious crises of their time? The science provides the what, but historians still have the crucial job of explaining the how and the why. This scientific study is a powerful example of how our understanding of the past is constantly evolving. A story that was once explained through the lens of divine will, and then through polygenomic theory, can now be seen through the lens of molecular biology, Each lens adds a new layer of understanding, a new depth of focus. You look at the final chart on the computer screen. It's a simple, elegant graph showing two lines. One line, representing the inbreeding coefficient, goes steadily up. The other line, representing the survival rate of the dynasty, goes steadily down. The two lines cross, forming a perfect tragic X. It is the entire two-year story of the Spanish Habsburgs, condensed into a single, devastating image. The motto was "Let others wage war." Private war against the fundamental laws of nature. And this graph is the final, irrefutable proof that they lost. The clinical, quiet hum of the laboratory fades, and you are left in a gentle, contemplative silence. The long, dramatic, and often tragic story has been told. The wars have been fought, the kings have died, the autopsies have been read, and the genetic code has been analyzed. All that's left is to reflect, to look back on this extraordinary tale and ask a simple question: what does it all mean? You are standing now in a place of memory, a vast and quiet museum of the mind. All the images you've seen are here: the wedding of Philip and Juana, the vast empire of Charles V, the inward minor standing family tree, the sad minor side portraits in the gallery, the empty cradle in the nursery, the frail, bewildered boy minus king on his throne, and a cold sarcophagus in the crypt. The story of the Habsburgs is, on the surface, a story about the dangers of inbreeding. It's a perfect, almost scientifically neat illustration of a biological principle. But it is also so much more than that. It is a story about ambition, and how the very tools used to achieve great ambition can become the instruments of ruin. Their great innovation, their killer app, was the marriage contract. They built an empire not with armies but with vows. It was a brilliant, forward-minded thinking strategy. But when they had acquired all they could, they turned that brilliant to inward, using it to preserve what they had won. They tried to create a closed system, a perfect fortress of blood and treasure. And in doing so, they created a trap. The very thing that made them powerful, their shared bloodline, became the poison that destroyed them. It's a story of an idea taken to its logical and ultimately fatal conclusion. It is a perfect, terrible irony. It is also a story about the collision between human will and the unyielding laws of nature. The Habsburgs were, for a time, the most powerful people on the planet. They could command armies, move mountains of gold, and change the course of nations with the stroke of a pen. They believed they were masters of their own destiny, agents of God's will on earth. But they could not command the silent, invisible, and utterly indifferent process of genetic inheritance. They could sign all the papal dispensations they wanted, but they could not dispense with the rules of biology. Their story is a humbling reminder that for all our power, for all our ambition, we are still subject to forces far older and more fundamental than any crown or scepter. And here's one final, curious thought to ponder. The most famous feature of the Habsburgs, the jaw, has become a kind of cultural shorthand. But what did it really represent? At the beginning of their story, it was a symbol of identity, of strong blood, of legitimacy. By the end, it had become a symbol of decay, of decadence, of a dynasty that had literally become a caricature of itself. Historians still debate how we should view the Habsburgs. Are they tragic figures, victims of a curse they could neither understand nor control? Or are they the authors of their own demise, a family whose obsessive pride and dynastic arrogance led them directly to their own extinction? The most compelling answer is that they were both. They were powerful, intelligent people, acting rationally according to the beliefs and knowledge of their time. And they were also, simultaneously, the unknowing agents of their own destruction, trapped in a slow motion tragedy that had been set in motion generations before they were even born. Their story feels both epic and deeply, painfully human. It is about the grand sweep of empires and the intimate sorrow of a nursery. It is about the balance of power in Europe and the microscopic dance of genes in a single family. It is a reminder that the greatest and most powerful houses can be brought down not by a foreign army, but by a quiet, persistent whisper in the blood. The empire, it was devoured by its own bloodline. And so here we are, at the end of our journey together through this long and winding tale. The great halls of the Habsburg palaces now stand empty and silent in your mind. The portraits in the gallery have turned their gaze away. The echo of the cannon fire from that long minus ago war has finally faded into a complete and peaceful quiet. You can let go of the details now. The names of the kings and queens, the dates of the treaties, the specifics of the science, you can allow them all to soften, to dissolve like sugar in warm water. They are no longer important. What remains is just the gentle rhythm of the story, a soft, undulating current that has carried you from a wedding in the 15th century to a laboratory in the 21st. You have stood in cathedrals and crypts, in nurseries and on battlefields. You have witnessed the birth of an empire and the slow, agonizing death of a dynasty. You saw how a family's greatest strength, the shared and sacred blood, could curdle over time into their most fatal weakness. You saw how their ambition to hold everything, to possess the world and keep it within their own grasp, led them to lose it all. It was a story of power and powerlessness, of immense wealth and profound biological poverty. Think of the family tree you saw in your mind's eye. At first, it was a healthy, branching thing, reaching outwards, seeking new connections. But then you watched as it began to curve, to bend back on itself. You saw it transform from a tree into a reef, a perfect, closed circle. It was meant to be a symbol of unity and permanence, a fortress to protect their legacy. But a closed circle is also a trap. There is no way in, and more importantly, no way out. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is the story of a family that slowly, methodically, and with the best of intentions locked itself inside its own legacy until the air grew thin and the lights finally, inevitably, went out. It is a story that reminds us that the grandest of human ambitions are always, in the end, subject to the quiet, ancient, and implacable laws of nature. You can build palaces of stone and gold, but you cannot build a healthy child out of broken genetic code. You can wear a crown, but you cannot command the tides of biology. The Habsburgs learned this lesson in the most tragic way possible. Theirs is a tale written in the language of irony, a quiet and cautionary whisper that echoes down to us through the centuries, a whisper about the fragility of power and the strange, unexpected ways that great houses can fall, not with a bang, but with a whimper, in the quiet sorrow of a royal nursery. And now the story is complete. The last word has been spoken, and it hangs in the air for a moment before dissolving into the quiet of your room. You can feel the narrative thread gently slip from your grasp, leaving you to float in the calm, still water of this present moment. The journey is over. There is nowhere else to go, nothing else to see. The palaces and portraits can all fade away now, like a dream upon waking. All that is left is the comfortable weight of your body, the gentle rise and fall of your own breath. You might imagine that with each breath you take, you are breathing in the quiet of the night, and with each breath out, you are releasing the last, lingering threads of the story, releasing any thoughts that may remain. There is only this space now, this soft, dark, peaceful space. A space just for you. You can feel a pleasant heaviness beginning to spread through your limbs, a deep, comfortable, and welcome feeling. It's the feeling of letting go, and now the quiet can do its work, allowing you to drift deeper and deeper into a place of profound rest. The story is a dream that is now over, making way for your own dreams to begin their gentle unfolding. The final word has been whispered. If your mind is still gently stirring, you're welcome to drift into another of my stories. If not, I wish you a deep and peaceful slumber. Good night.